Welcome everyone tonight. This is, I guess, episode 2 of Disability and Voting. We had our first event on Monday where in Brevard County we went to go visit with the supervisor of elections and his staff. They brought out voting machines, the ADA voting machines, and a lot of our families immediately registered to vote. It was an amazing event. I'm hoping that if you are in different counties that you reach out to your supervisor of elections and schedule an event like this, see if they would be willing to kind of bring out those voting machines and let families who've never had that experience before go and interact and ask questions and just get involved as we get ready for the midterms coming up. So, because of that, we had a lot of families reach out with concerns, questions about the SAVE Act. We've had families ask questions about mail-in ballots. So I invited these two amazing guests tonight. I have Laura Lee Minutello from Disability Rights Florida and Abdelilah from ACLU Florida. And I'm going to let you guys go ahead and introduce yourselves and then we'll get started.
Abdelilah, you want to go ahead?
Sure, thanks. So hi everyone, my name is Abdelilah Skhir. I am a senior campaign strategist in the policy and advocacy department here at the ACLU Florida. I've been with the organization for going on 6 years now, and I help out in designing our advocacy campaigns and reaching out to elected officials like supervisors of elections that NIcole mentioned. So I'm really glad to be able to talk about voting and everything that goes into that. So I'll pass it over to Laura.
Hey everyone, I'm Laura Minutello. I am the Senior Public Policy Analyst at Disability Rights Florida. Been with the agency for a little over 4 years now. I help with all of DRF's public policy work, but also oversee our voting work that's done through our PAVA grant, the Protection and Advocacy for Voter Access Grant, which is specifically geared toward uh, ensuring access for people with disabilities to the ballot. And just for personal context, um, for those of you that don't know me, some of you watching this or here may know me, but I also am a person with cerebral palsy, so have that very personal experience of voting with a disability as well.
I appreciate you saying that. I think that sometimes, especially we get into our professional hats, and sometimes people may not understand kind of personally where our connection to disability comes from. With that in mind, I'll go ahead and share that for those who don't know me and later on are watching this, I am a disabled veteran. Husband is a disabled veteran, and we have two children with disabilities. And so that's where we come to the conversation of disability and voting right now. I am the president of the One Voice Coalition Florida, as well as the director for One Voice Brevard, our advocacy branch of that organization. And pretty soon we'll get to formally announce this new statewide intellectual developmental disability advocacy organization that we are getting ready to start. We'll share that information later. But I wanted to share real quickly that a lot of families that we talked to had questions from our legislative conversation about, good Lord, what was it, like 2 months ago, 3 months ago when legislative session officially ended, even though we've had what, Part B, C, D, E,
Yeah,
G,
the
I don't,
never-ending legislative session.
it never ended. But as we did the conversation for that policy wrap up, there was quite a few concerns and questions around the issue of voting. So I thought it prudent to have this specific session where we just kind of broke down some of those barriers and conversations and talked specifically about disability and voting. Um, I think, let's go back to legislative session. Let's talk about what was it? House Bill 991. Am I saying that right, Abdelia? Okay, yes,
Yes,
thank
that's
you.
correct.
House Bill 991. This was, I think some people called it the Florida Mini Save Act, but it's titled Elections. Would one of you care to kind of discuss or talk that through?
Abdelilah, you want to start and I can kind of jump in?
Sure, yeah. Thanks. So As Nicole mentioned, this was a piece of legislation that worked its way through the legislature this year. It was a historically uh, slow year for the legislature, believe it or not, during this year's session. They found a lot of time to bicker and, throw pot shots at each other and have their own little pissing contests. But one of the pieces of legislation that they did find time to pass was this bill. And it's one that creates some barriers to voting. And it was one that our organization, as well as Disability Rights Florida and a whole host of other organizations, were really pushing back on. And, just for example, some of the barriers that it creates to voting, it removes current options for presenting ID at the polls for voters. One of them being student IDs. So going forward, thankfully, we were able to have the bill take effect this next January. So it won't affect this year's election. But afterwards, student IDs will no longer be able to be used at the polls to verify your identity. Senior retirement center IDs won't be able to be used for that purpose, and neither will public assistance IDs. And so, just from hearing the kinds of ID that will no longer be accepted at the polls, you can already guess that this is going to hit hardest voters who are students and living in dorms, for example, um, elderly voters, and low income voters. And out of all of those three populations, the disability community is going to be hit even harder because these kinds of things stack on top of each other, right? If you don't have access to your documentation, for example, that's already an additional barrier that's going to come on top of being, an elderly voter who has to live in an assisted living facility, right? So these are things that stack one on top of another and just make it that much harder to register to vote and to actually vote at the polls. Laura, was there anything
Yeah,
that I'm missing
and
on here?
so
Yeah,
yeah,
go for it.
so just to add to that, I think, the point about ID specifically. So when this bill was passed, one of the talking points that folks used in order to pass it was the fact that, 98% or something of Floridians were already compliant with the Real ID and had their documentation on file. That is only that's a big misnomer, because it is only talking about 98% of the people that we're aware of, right? So when we're talking people with disabilities, as Abdelilah said, we're not accounting for the difficulty of, the elderly, many of whom have disabilities, or, any other group that's marginalized, really. We're not accounting for the disability of getting those the um, hardship of getting those documents in the first place. And so we know it's a little bit hard to find the numbers exactly, but we know that many people with disabilities don't have ID. They don't have the access to those documents. Things like getting a birth certificate, could be more complicated. They may not have the money to get the documentation that they need. If even if something is 30, let's say, documentation is $30. If you are somebody with a disability that's on a fixed income, or um, having to pay for other resources that are typically not something that the majority of the population experience, your money is going to be tight. You may not have the resources. And so, end of the day, also, I think something we don't talk about is just how fatigued people with disabilities can be. So for a lot of us, life in general is a lot harder. So when you take something like voting, that should really be the easiest thing to access, right? When that is made difficult, a lot of people are just going to say, I don't want to do it because I don't have the energy and I don't have the spoons. It's spoon theory, right? We have to use spoons for things that we need to live life. And for a lot of people, voting then becomes sort of an optional, into that optional category, which is not what we as voting rights advocates want to see. We believe, ACLU believes, DRF believes that voting should be one of the easiest things that we do. And so I think it's also important to mention, just so that folks know, that the sponsor of one of the sponsors of that bill, Jenna Persons Mullica, is also now the Lee County Supervisor of Elections. So very much in this space, and I just say that because there may be some opportunities to interact in different ways to get our concerns across, or just for informational purposes, um, as folks are, interacting with their elected officials. She's still an elected official. She's now um, very much more in the voting space, so it's something that we should be aware of.
No, I think that's important. So what I'm going to go ahead and do real quick is I'm going to put a copy of the link for this particular bill in the chat for those who would like to see it. And I'll also make sure that a lot of this gets sent out with our recording and our YouTube notes. So I'll put that in the notes as well. So you can go back and you can look through all the information in particular about this bill. But let's go a little bit deeper real quick, because I recently had a conversation with a couple of people, and we were just talking about the understanding of what a disability is. And I think that's really important to this conversation when we talk about accessibility. And it's not just about the disability community, because I think when you talk about accessibility, we're looking at almost any kind of minority group, right? Because this is a broader this is a broader issue than just disability. Statistically speaking, if we say that the CDC says that 1 in 4 people have a disability, and if, the state of Florida in all of its greatness is one of those places that people come to retire, and we talk about the population makeup of what our state looks like, I would imagine that the statistics are probably a bit more skewed, right? Towards 1 in 4, I'm going to say maybe 1 in 3, or even 1 in 2. If you talk about like the broader scope of who in your life might be touched by disability, understanding that that moves a lot, like this broadens that picture, right? Because we're not just talking about disabled people, we're now talking about anybody. Um, and I think that some people may not always understand what is a disability, because I feel like that can also be polarized or popularized depending upon, like where you get your news. So maybe that's also worth mentioning right now. I don't know if one of you wanted to kind of dig just a little bit deeper into shade.
I'll take a
Yeah.
first crack at it. Yeah, I mean, there are federal and state definitions of disability, but to your point, I think it's definitely hard to kind of quantify, because there are also folks that have limitations, whether that be mobility or otherwise, that don't consider themselves disabled. And that to me is kind of where we get to the crux of, like, this is a lot bigger than we say that it is. So technically, I mean, federal definition of disability has to do with impairments in daily active ADLs, activities of daily living. So you have to have a certain there are certain things, whether it's, for me physically, I can't walk, and so my activities of daily living are impaired. That could be something even that's not documented currently. It could be something that's in the past. It could be a temporary disability, which is not covered under the ADA but is covered under some other laws. So there are kind of, it's a little bit hard, right? Because then Florida also has their definitions of developmental disability and some definitions that really don't align completely with the ADA. So I like to think of it really just in terms of not, the federal or the state definition, but really anything that a person themselves or would consider affects their activities of daily living. Or if you can even, if we're talking about an elderly person who maybe doesn't consider themselves disabled, or to your point, NIcole, even somebody that's a English, doesn't English as a second language learner, that could be a language disability because the world isn't built for that or we're speaking English and they speak, Haitian Creole. So it's really kind of it can be a fluctuating definition. And in that, I just kind of wanted to I was thinking as you're talking, I think one of the reasons that it's important to talk about accessibility is there are a lot of things that um could help. For instance, at the polling place there has to be one accessible voting machine per polling place um for a federal election. And so that, when we talk about English as a second language, those machines can read to folks in their own language. Most of them in Florida are set up for Spanish. Some areas might be set up for Haitian Creole as well. So those are something that really are open to or should be open to everybody. And that was something that the bill, this particular 991, tried to change and tried to make sure that was just confined to disability. And it still kind of is, right? But they're not allowed to ask. So, you can just say, like, hey, I want to use the accessible voting machine. That really is open to everybody. And that was something that DRF pushed back hard on because we're like, how are you going to
Determine.
determine if somebody's disabled?
Yeah.
Without us, and then it's discriminatory, and so I don't know, Abdelilah, if you have any of that.
I was going to say, I think that that's perfect, Laura, because some people, and I'm going to be one of those that I never considered myself disabled, as sometimes it may be a mindset. But in addition to that, you may not understand that you are a part of the minority group when you come into that world. I had a teacher once tell me that disability is the only minority group that's always taking applications. And so I just want that to sit for a minute for anyone who may listen to this later, because all it takes is a car accident or and then you are in our world.
But I like to say too, like, if you live long enough, you most likely are going to age into disability. So
exactly that.
You're
not here now.
I was one of those people that, was disabled from birth, so I have a different experience than you, Nicole. But yeah, I can imagine that it's really kind of, because I mean, I even know that I struggle to see myself as like, there are some days like this will really be shocking to folks because they're really like, you're in a wheelchair. Like, what do you mean? But like, CP is not at the forefront of my mind. Like, it's just how I move through the world. So there are days in my life, honestly, that I don't even think about how disability impacts me. So that can be even true when you have something really outwardly visible. And so I think it's such a personal construct.
It really, really is. I think that's beautiful. And thank you for sharing, because some people may not understand that when you talk about ableism, or just at least, perception. But I was going to ask Abdelilah, because from the ACLU's perspective, especially when we talk about minority representation and access, because for disability, everything is about access, right? Like everything we talk about comes with that lens. But when you look broader and we're talking about minority groups as a whole, can you give us some insight from the ACLU in our state, like when we talk about accessibility, as we continue that conversation?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Disability rights are civil rights, and so that is something that our organization has stood for before, whether it was fighting for the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and it's something that we really want to lean into as we go into this next election season. Um, just trying to. I always like to let people know how they can plug in and help out. So, both of our organizations, ACLU Florida and Disability Rights Florida, we're part of a really large coalition of organizations who are part of this election protection coalition. And so what we do in that group is during early voting or on election day, we have folks out at polling places to help out any voters if they need assistance, if they need information, if maybe they got turned away at the polls. There's a hotline that we can call, that you can call, and we can drop that phone number in the chat. But part of that program is also, thanks to DRF, uh, taking those folks and ensuring that those polling places are ADA compliant, because it's something that Laura says, all the time at the Capitol during session. The Americans with Disabilities Act isn't a suggestion, it's the law. So uh, part of that goes into making sure that every polling place is ADA compliant and that voters with disabilities can vote unobstructed. Because a lot of times it's simply something out of ignorance, where maybe a clerk or an election official just didn't even think of, oh well, there should be a ramp that leads to this entrance for
Yeah.
wheelchair users, or whatever voting assistance someone might need. Maybe they just didn't have the proper training, the clerk did. So a lot of this is just kind of reminding folks of the law and ensuring that they're complying with the law. And at least in my experience, they're always happy to be corrected on that, because our local election officials do want to ensure that as many registered voters are able to vote come election day. And so a lot of that comes up in guidance, or just pointing out, hey, there's at this polling place, there's not enough, there are no, disabled parking spaces, for example. And so making them aware of that is something that goes a long way to not just fixing the issue right then and there, but then building the trust and relationships between elected officials. And so if anyone is watching this and you want to help out with that, you can sign up to be a poll monitor through our Election Protection Coalition.
Oh yeah, I'm absolutely wanting you to put that in the chat. I think I met this amazing woman, Laura, when we were at Family Cafe.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, what there was a lady that was doing the speech. She
The
was from the
It
AAPD.
was Maria Town. She's the
Yes.
CEO
And so
of
I'm
them.
trying to find that photo or the picture I took of the 1-800 number, and I'm gonna try to find that and put it, if Adelia finds it before me, please put it in the chat. But
So on that note too is we Abdullah said like we are DRF is
that's
part
it.
of that.
Thank you.
We help staff that hotline. So if there's any disability kind of related concerns, we also have our own hotline, which I will put. But either way, you can get to us. And I
Yeah.
think too, something you mentioned, Abdullah, is really a lot of it is about communication because, for instance, so many polling places are churches, and that is something that supervisors really struggle with because churches and places of worship in general, not everybody knows this, are exempt from the ADA under normal operating conditions, not when they are polling places, but um a lot of times it can cause access barriers when they're acting as polling places because they don't have the infrastructure to normally be accessible. And on the flip side, supervisors really do their best to get as many polling places as possible and really just sometimes struggle with getting volunteers or places to volunteer to be polling places in churches and other places of worship, mosques, synagogues, things like that. Um, Fill a lot of that gap, but there are temporary measures that can be taken, even to include that day. So, you're at the polling place and that, like Abdullah mentioned, there's not enough parking spaces. You call into that election protection hotline. You know, I get a call through, those channels. I'm able to call the SOE and say, hey, we need to have more temporary parking set up that's accessible. So it really is kind of like if you see something, say something, or if you're worried, go and talk to your SOE ahead of time. So a lot of that is that communication is really important.
Yeah, I was gonna go further and say that there was a lady that was sitting in front of me, and I need her energy in my life. She was wearing a cape, like Adelia, you had to see her, but like she's just amazing. She said that she's like a second generation poll monitor.
Yeah, she
Her
was amazing.
mother was doing this, and then she was doing it for like 30 plus years. Um, I'm gonna see if I can set up a Zoom, and I'd love to have you come back, Abdelia, maybe to talk about this like in particular later, so we can unpack poll monitoring and what that means and how important that is. Because I honestly like, so I'll again, I go back to the military. We lived overseas for so long that like it's only recently I've been able to actually vote in person.
Right.
More recently, in my experience. So getting to see that through a different lens and understanding poll monitoring and what that means when you go into a room and what are the options that you have available. For example, in the last election, there was a place that I went to that had only two handicap parking spots and they were completely packed. And when we go in and there's nothing else there. So understanding what your rights are when you arrive at the polling location, and the safeguards that are put into place, I think that's something that we should definitely dive into in just a minute. But let's go back just, real quickly because that was a lot that we talked about. So initially, we'll just say that we talked about the first Florida bill. A lot of people have been hearing in the news about the SAVE Act, right, at the federal level. And there was a recent final rule that was discussed from USPS about mail in ballots. So before we go too far down the line that we talk about like when you arrive at a polling location or whatever, can we talk a little bit about mail in ballots? Maybe the statistics of how, people who are, and it's not just disability, but like I said, veterans that use mail in ballots. So can we talk a little bit about what was this that happened with USPS? Can we talk about what does that look like in Florida for mail-in ballots? Because I think it's important for people to understand that if you had been using mail-in ballots as your primary method of voting, you had to go back and re-register. So let's talk a little bit about that, and then, I think we should go back.
Sure.
Yeah, those are two different things, but Abdullah, you can
Yeah.
No,
take it.
I was about to say I took the last one first, so why don't you take this one first, and then I
Okay, so
can
I'll
support.
start with the you have to re-register. Yes, that is true. So that has actually been the case for a few like a cycle, not like a cycle or two now. But a lot of people are not aware that it used to be the case where you registered for vote by mail, you got your vote by mail, you didn't have to register quite as often. Now you have to redo it every cycle. So at the end of this election, um the midterm elections, you will have to re-up if you want to get for the next cycle. So you have to every time, and that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that you've been voting by mail for 20 years. You have to do it every election cycle. And in and around that, while we're talking about vote by mail, I think it's also important to mention that if you're using accessible vote by mail, which for those that may not know what that is, because it's a pretty new concept for Florida anyway. So in 2020, the Florida Council of the Blind brought a suit based on something that was in statute for over 30 years, and that was that individuals with disabilities had the right to vote accessibly, and to include vote by mail. So what happens now, and this is every county, I would get this question all the time because originally it was a pilot, but it is every county now, is that you request your vote by mail ballot, and there's usually a checkbox that says that you want accessible vote by mail. So then what happens is that the supervisor will send you a link to your email. You're able to then fill out a vote by mail ballot with your screen reader technology or whatever you use. But you do have to print it out and return it in the same way that you would a regular non-accessible, um, or not marked as accessible vote by mail ballot. So whether that's through Dropbox, whether that's through the mail, there is no kind of return process that is electronic. And there are 11 or 12 states that do have electronic return processes. I know that there are some people have security concerns. It's just not a way that Florida has moved. Um, and for people with disabilities, especially blind and visually impaired voters, that can be frustrating, right? Because, if you have a visual impairment, printing it out and then signing it, all those things are still going to be impacted. So it's not fully accessible, but it does make the process a little bit easier in that you can use the screen reader technology or whatever other technology you require in the comfort of your home. Um, what was your other, what was the other part of the question, Nicole? Sorry.
No, I'm sorry. I probably put a lot of that in one sentence because I was talking a bit about the mail-in ballots, and the reason I brought that up was because of this
Oh, the
recent.
USPS. Okay,
Yeah.
so um, the the US the so the I just get so
No,
I
it's
guess
okay.
so.
Actually, it may be prudent. Let's take a moment,
Yeah, yeah.
We envision, World Cup. I don't know, but it's worth probably mentioning for those who weren't familiar. But there was a recent discussion in the federal government about a final rule to have the USPS have what I'm gonna try to say this because there's a lot like that I'm still wrapping my brain around. But I guess that the rule discussed having access to the voter logs, right? Like the voter
Yes.
information in the state level. And essentially there might be a penalty associated with states who didn't release this information to verify voter mail-in ballots or voter information when they receive the ballot, USPS or yeah, USPS. Um, Outside of the fact that we need to probably acknowledge that this has never been within the purview of United States Postal Service
Oh, it's
to,
completely illegal.
yeah,
Let's just start there.
I,
And Abdullah, I've
yeah,
been out of the office all week, but I did see the courts have actually said at this point that it is illegal, correct?
That's
So,
correct. Yeah,
so the USPS, they essentially they this rule would this proposed rule, it's not enacted or anything, but would require um the the states to send their voter rolls, send those that are registered for vote by mail to a portal created by the USPS.
correct,
And from there, the USPS could, depending on how that information matches up, they could decline to mail people ballots or decline to return them.
correct.
And so, the
And I think
comment,
it's also important to say at this time, wasn't there also a Supreme Court decision that came out about mail-in ballots? Like all of this happened at the same time. I feel like this week was incredible for mail-in ballots, but there was like a Supreme Court decision that said you can have mail-in ballots that are postmarked the date of the
yes,
election, correct? Am I saying that?
right.
I'm probably
yeah,
not saying this
no, you
Yeah,
are. That's
professionally.
correct.
Okay, so
Abdullah, do you want
yeah,
to
I'm gonna actually let him do it because he's the
yeah, yeah,
professional
sure.
in this space.
No,
So
no, no worries,
this
no
all
worries at
happened
all.
in 1 week, right? Like this is
Right.
just insane in one
Yeah,
week.
exactly. Like most election laws, every state does things a little bit differently. So in Florida, your vote by mail ballot has to be in the election official's possession when polls close, or otherwise it won't be counted. In other states, however, their law allows for as long as the ballot is postmarked by election day, much in the same way that if you mail your taxes, as long as it's postmarked by tax day, it is not late. And so that's why you see sometimes in states like California and Pennsylvania, those ballots that are postmarked on election day are still valid and they count. So the Supreme Court decision did say, yes, states have a right to do this, to allow that to be done. I think that would be a good positive step for Florida to take as well. Like I said, it's the same concept. I'm sure all the folks in there who make those laws have filed their taxes on April 15th, and there should not be a penalty because, in my opinion, if you get in before a deadline, you got in before the deadline, right? And I think when it comes to your right to vote, that should go even further, right? So I did want to bring up this statistic that NIcole flagged earlier in the week, and it's a really good one because it kind of speaks to the importance of vote by mail. So the Election Assistance Commission put out a report a couple of years ago, and they looked at the 2022 election, and people with disabilities had 20% likelihood of facing difficulties voting in person, compared to 6% of people without disabilities. That's in person, but when it comes to voting with a mail ballot, that drops tremendously to only 6% among people with disabilities and fewer than 1% among people without disabilities. And so we're talking about not just voting by mail is convenient. Absolutely. It's a lot more convenient to, sit in your living room and fill out your ballot. You can research all the candidates and issues on your own time, and then you drop in the mailbox and you're good to go. But it's not just an issue of convenience, it's also accessibility, because if you do have a disability, you're way less likely to face an issue when you're casting your ballot through this method. And so when what it was since the 2020 election that in Florida specifically, year after year after year, they would tinker with the vote by mail rules. They would make it a little bit less accessible. They would take away some drop box availability. They would make it so that you have to apply for vote by mail every single election cycle. And so these are changes that increase the hurdles for participating in our democracy. And like I said earlier, it gets magnified when you talk about being a voter with a disability and another population for another community, for example, that has those kind of structural barriers to begin with. So, it's just one of those. Just one change can really get an exponential harm when it comes to creating barriers for voting.
Yeah, I tried to put while we were going through the conversation a couple of helpful links in the chat. I took just a bit of the report. I actually put the link for this report that we're referencing right now. This was a I'm gonna say this wrong. Rutgers. I always
it's
say that
red,
wrong.
yeah, it's Rutgers,
Rutgers?
and
Am I saying
they,
that? Okay, there we
yeah,
go.
yeah, no, you were saying that
Okay.
right. And so it's Doug Cruz and Lisa Skhir are the
Okay.
preeminent disability voting scholars. They put out reports
Right.
every election cycle. They don't have the I don't think they have the one from the
No, I was
2024 public
digging.
yet.
Look, yeah,
Yeah.
I have seen some stats from that. I They did say we can share some of those, so I don't feel bad sharing those. Although I know that those reports aren't out, and so I think another one that's good to highlight though is that the voter gap. So traditionally, over their years of research, they've identified that individuals with disabilities in general vote at a lower percentage than those without disabilities. And that is not because we are less engaged, it is strictly because of these barriers. Now, the good news is that a few years ago that gap was 7, 8, 9%. It's down to about 5, so we are shrinking. And I know that doesn't sound like much, but also it's a lot both ways, because if you think about 5% of the voting population, that's a lot of people. And then NIcole, to your earlier point, we're not even just talking about those with disabilities or that might have disability related issues that they don't consider disabilities. We're also talking about families, right? So when
Caregivers.
you broaden it out, the voting block of folks with disabilities or the folks that are disability adjacent is huge. It's enough to really change policy. So I think that is also a really important statistic. But yes, John Cruz and Lisa Skhir, they're great people, and also do really great research.
Yeah, I went and put the link for that report that we were talking about before. I put it in the chat, and then like the most recent thing I put in the chat was that statistic that kind of Abdelilah and I were talking about before. it goes in my mind to like if you've been following elections, and perhaps you won't because you're not a nerd like I am, and you look at these things. But so um, recently, when I start getting into more policy work and things like this, and I watch very closely, like what is the turnout? Like what is and so we look at midterm election, what we call this is what we're coming up to. I think people need to also understand the differences in the voter turnout, right, for midterms versus, a presidential election. Um, we're coming up on a midterm. So this is different. This is not the big grand, but maybe we should take a moment to emphasize the importance of this one. Because at least if you look by county, I know every county has things done a little bit differently, but I looked in Brevard before we jumped onto this call, and these are just rough numbers. So just to give you an idea. So if you're listening to this later, if in our county we have, let's say, 600,000 people who are eligible to vote. Let's just say they're eligible. They're of age, they meet the requirements, they're just eligible. Roughly of those 600,000, maybe 400,000 of them actually registered to vote, right? So that's like a huge chunk already gone, right, of this pie because they're not registered to vote. They just for whatever reason made the choice not to engage in this process. When we talk about of the registered voters who show up and participate in midterm elections, that percentage of the pie shrinks even significantly more, right? So it goes from where we're at maybe 400,000 people to let's say 200,000 people. Because usually the percentages is 20 to 40%, right? If I mean, I might be a little under, but I feel like that's almost even a general uh, adding, right? Statistically speaking, to a midterm election turnout. So if people think of it that way, we're talking about only a very small percentage of the county that actually show up and vote in midterm elections. So as we have, and we probably are now winding down, and I feel like we didn't even get to everything, but I want to kind of maybe leave with why is it so important for people to show up to vote. I put in the chat like the deadlines that are coming up because we have, the primaries and then you have the general election. I put those deadlines in the chat, but maybe both of you could give me, from your perspective, with your experience, why is it so important? I've heard so many excuses like, oh, my vote doesn't matter, like someone's gonna cancel out my vote or whatever. But why is it so important? And why is this election so important? What would you like people to know?
Yeah, I can start off. It's there's a lot going on at the federal level, obviously, right? That's always going to be the case. So you can everyone has their own reasons for engaging in the process, right? You can look at the federal level, and me personally, I'm not okay with a lot of things that are going on right now, and so that informs my reasoning for wanting to get engaged, right? When we see the attacks on our civil liberties at the federal level, our rights, the weaponization of government, right? Um, but let's take away the federal government for just a second, right? Just a second, because like you said, historically, these midterm elections, as they're called, have less turnout than the presidential elections. And at the state level, those are the elections that we elect our governor, right? So there is going to be a new governor after this year's election. And that is important because, if it's important for you uh, that Florida expands Medicaid, right? We're one of only a handful of states that have yet to do so. That's an important office that can move things and make it happen. State agencies that are really tasked with taking care of Florida's disabled community and ensuring that they too can live a life of dignity without having to rely on a caretaker unless they require one, right? So those agencies have budgets, And the ones who really set the budget is the head of the executive, right? So if that is what is important to you, that's on the ballot, right? Even beyond the state level, let's talk the local community that affects your life every single day, your county commissions, your cities, right? Those are going to be on the ballot this August. So there's a primary and election. A lot of people in August. A lot of people they think, oh, I can't vote in the primaries because I'm not part of a party. That's not true. There are local government offices on the ballot, whether it's county commission, city commission. There are judges that are going to be on the ballot, and that is an area where those people really they rule on cases that affect your rights. And so, regardless of what the parties look like, what the candidates look like, I totally understand those frustrations. Um, but there is something for you on the ballot. And when you look at some of these special elections that have been held over the last year or since the 2024 election, quite literally, there have been some elections that were decided by 100 or so votes, and so that is really a situation where every single vote matters. So whether you're voting on uh, with your interests in mind, maybe you're voting, maybe you're going into the voting booth thinking of a family member or a friend who is part of a community that is really facing some hard times because of actions that our state and federal government have decided to do. That it's important to find out to figure out why voting is important to you and keep that in mind when you're doing it. So that's kind of my answer to that.
Thank you.
That was a great answer. It's going to be hard to follow, Abdelilah, but I mean more or less I agree. I think I'm so glad that you brought up the importance of local elections too, because I think people really forget about that in terms of that has a large effect as on our lives and our communities. And so for me, in addition to everything you said, because I agree with all of it, um, just as a person with a disability, every issue is a disability issue. Like there's not a section of life where disability doesn't impact, or other minorities. And so we all just kind of take our experiences, and I feel very personally that if I'm not voting and engaged in this process, then that's one less person with a disability that's represented. I also, you said it really well, Avila, too. All of that filters up and down. So everything that goes on at the federal level impacts, and vice versa. So, for instance, I'm gonna talk about our favorite subject our least favorite subject for the last couple of weeks, NIcole. The DOJ um, came out with a memo that says that the home and community-based services are not are not required. States really, and the Office of Legal Counsel has said that they don't that except for in cases where it would be they would be somebody would be institutionalized just because they have a disability, that the states are not required to then um, provide home and community-based services necessarily. So that is a legal opinion. I will clarify that with that is not law. That at this point that is a legal opinion, and what's going to follow is my own personal opinion, not the opinion of Disability Rights Florida necessarily. But as a person that uses home and community-based services, that's worrisome to me. But um, as much as that is going on the federal level, it's also going on at the state level. It's going to have reverb into the state legislature. It's going to have reverb into how things are locally organized, and how or how not people are included in our local communities too. So it's, even though that is a legislative, or that is a federal opinion at this point, not the law. Olmstead and the ADA still require those things. I'll just be clear about that. There is going to be a lot of reverb for things like that. And as Abdullah said, like, I'm not okay with a lot of the things personally going on right now. But whether you are okay or you're not okay, you know, that's my personal opinion. But um it's up to all of us to voice our desires for the country and kind of collectively come together to make that a reality. So
Yeah.
you don't have to share Abdelah's opinion, you don't have to share my opinion, you don't have to share NIcole's opinion. It's about exercising your right to see the future for the country and for yourself and your kids that you want to see. So that's why I think it's important.
I love I love both of those things. I hope if you guys don't mind, if I can be just a little personal for a minute. It's just because I don't usually don't talk a lot about my experiences when I was active duty, but in this case, I feel like it's really important because I served in an environment. I was deployed after 9/11 and to a place that was not ever something that I would recommend to visit. And so when we talk about your right to vote personally, and I'm, outside of politics, outside of personal beliefs or feelings, to work and to exist in a country that has no voice, where as a person that you live, you're there to see what it's like for people who are in these countries that have no voice in their government. I just wanted to share, if it's worth anything, how impactful, perhaps, and I'm trying to say it without getting emotional, but I was just going to say that I think that to witness, and to take that in, especially I think from a woman's perspective, and from someone who grew up a little bit differently maybe than other people. But I come back home and I've always participated in elections, but it felt very abstract. When you're overseas and you do a mail-in ballot, it's difficult because you're not directly at home. You're not there. You don't get to see firsthand what the results of these, decisions are. So it can feel very abstract. But when you are in these places that have none of these protections, none of that feels abstract anymore. So coming home, getting to actually go and mail or like to vote in person, like for the very first time in my life, was one of those memories, those core memories that, Disney likes to say, like it sticks with me forever. Um, because it was for the first time where I got to feel that in a whole different light. So I'm hoping that if nothing else from tonight, if you were with us now or if you watch this video recording later, that you feel empowered, that you feel a sense of purpose even to engage this session. Maybe it's your first time. Maybe you haven't voted in the last couple times. Maybe you finally feel like, okay, I can do this. Because I think that they like to say that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, right?
Yeah.
So let's have this decisions are made by those who show up. And what a privilege it is to be able to show up. So I'm gonna say that we'll probably end it around there, but if you enjoyed this, I hope you'll let us know. I can't thank you guys enough. Abdelia, Laura, this has been honestly fun for me to kind of talk a little bit about these things. I hope that everyone who watches this later enjoys it. We're going to do more conversations like this for sure. But yeah, and I hope as we talk about July, right, we are getting ready to celebrate the nation's 250th anniversary, the signing of ADA 36th anniversary, right? All of this is worth mentioning on a conversation that we get to sit openly and talk about disability rights and access to voting. So with that, as we get ready to go into the 4th of July weekend, I hope everyone has a fantastic weekend. So thank you, everybody.